And we're live.
And good evening, everybody. Seems to be my voice is shaky here, right there. Welcome on behalf of Dieter Staudinger and myself, Capt Ron. We are back again for another edition of Fearless Flight Live, which is designed to help anybody out there who has a fear of flying. Maybe some of you are living with someone who has a fear and you don't have it yourself, or people who just want to know what the heck's going on in the airline industry. And that seems to be the thing. So let me refer to the slides, and we're going to bring in our guest. You know what? Actually, I'm going to bring in our guest. No, I'm going to do the slides like I always do, so it looks like we had some semblance of order here. And here we go. Okay, so there we are. Welcome, everybody. This is our weekly Fearless Flight Live show, 6:30 p.m. on the Pacific, 9:30 for all you involuntary night owls out there on the East Coast, including our guest tonight. We have our Fearless Flight Birds of a Feather private Facebook group on Facebook. We always encourage you to join. If you have not joined, when you do join, leave a message and jump in with both feet and talk to others out there who share your plight.
Tonight, I want to make a quick shout out here to John Iliev, who has been one of, I'm gonna say, one of those students that you really love to have, because they have determination, they have self-motivation, and John posted this the screenshot of himself booking the longest flight yet, and it is long. It's from LAX to Shanghai, PVG. Whoa. And that's almost 14 hours. So kudos to you, John, and would love to have you back when you're back and get to hear what that journey was like for you. All right.
Well, not to one-up you, John, but I had mine on last July escorting one of our followers from Kennedy to Manila, and that was my longest, 17 hours and 5 minutes. And I know now why I didn't fly long haul when I was flying there. So anyway, all right, we're gonna bring our guest on just a minute. Arnold Barnett. He's an awesome guest, and he's been with us several times. And I want to highlight the 101 classes in the LA area. It's getting close. I talked to the owner over there. It looks like March 8th will be good. I have to get now. Dieter and I have to collaborate and see if we can get our act together and still make that class date. So you'll be hearing about that hopefully this week. We'll just promo the monthly group webinar for March. It should say March up there, and of course, we'll always take your questions.
All right. So what's going on in Chicago? Because we got
what's going on? Yeah, many of you. The kind of the antithesis of personalizing thing. It's like the universe says, "Here, we'll give you a really current topic for your show tonight, Capt Ron." And many of you may have heard, to your chagrin, that the Southwest, of course, the headline says, nearly collides with a private jet. I saw it, and I'm not endorsing the fact of what happened, but looks like they had a business jet cross the runway at the departure end. It looked like the takeoff was normal. It didn't look like the crew, and that's a very short runway. That's only 5,000 feet, all those runways in Midway, Chicago's Midway. So we're grateful that it wasn't, that it didn't result in an accident, but we'll find out what they say about that. And that'll lead us right into tonight's topic. As I mentioned, tonight we've got Dr. Arnold Barnett. He's the George Eastman Professor of, I can't read my notes here, of Management Science and Professor of Statistics at MIT's Sloan School of Management. He has a PhD in math from MIT, and he's done what many call groundbreaking research, focused on applying statistical analysis to health and safety, with a particular emphasis on aviation. I first came across his work in 2007. He'd been active much before then. I was really, really impressed. I was so impressed I was intimidated. And then I finally got over that back in 2019 or something like that, and reached out to him personally and found he's warm and wonderful. And we've been at least more than acquaintances since that time. He has actually participated in one of my classes over in the Burbank area, and he's been on the show. I think this is about the third time. He's called the nation's leading expert on aviation safety by NBC News, and he's worked with a number of airlines, a number of airports, and the FAA. I'd be curious just to ask him what he does with them. That'd be interesting. And his contributions to aviation safety earned him the President's Citation for the Flight Safety Foundation, assuming that, I'll do a little political joke, assuming that organization is still in business. And beyond his research, he's also an award-winning educator, honored 15 times for outstanding teaching at MIT. I like him because of his teaching skills. He brings it down to where even I can understand it. So Dr. Barnett, Arnie, welcome to the show. And if you want to bring your face on the screen, I will stop the share here. And welcome. Are you ready for bed there? I really appreciate you extending yourself at this hour of the day. That's above and beyond for sure.
Well, it's really no problem. I'm a night owl, but
good.
It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I couldn't endorse what FearlessFlight.com is doing more. I myself used to be afraid to fly, so I have the greatest sympathy and understanding of people who are nervous about flying. And now I'm a statistician, and I'm able to get some comfort from statistics as well as context of those statistics. Not everyone is, but on the other hand, let me tell you some things statistically about flying in the United States now, taking into account all of the stimuli we get, including the news from today. I was on YouTube a little while ago, and I can't tell you how many videos there were of the landing or near landing at Chicago Midway. And I imagine the net effect is people to think, oh my God, it almost happened again.
Right.
But first of all, if you want a number, I'll give you a number. For the United States, if you're really worried about the risk of being killed, and I think that's what really people are worried about. They're not worried about getting a bad airline meal because there are no meals anymore. It's rather the chance of being killed. Roughly speaking, and not so roughly speaking, but pretty accurately, the risk now, if you board a flight in the United States or in lots of countries that are similar to the United States, the United Kingdom, for example, all of the countries in the European Union, or for that matter, countries like Israel and Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and even mainland China. Whatever you might think of mainland China, in aviation these days, they have an outstanding safety record. But anyway, if you were to board a flight of one of these airlines, the chance have a boarding pass, the chance you would die during your air journey is about 1 in 100 million. And by air journey, by the way, I mean from the moment you arrive at the airport of origin to the moment you leave the airport at your destination. In other words, it even considers the possibility of terrorism at the airports. It is a slight source of risk, so I include it in the calculation. Now, you might say 1 in 100 million. And, I've said that to people who are afraid to fly. And you know what they say? I'll be the 1 in 100 million.
Right. I've had it expressed to me, Arnie, that we're much better at thinking in terms of possibilities than we are probabilities.
Well, that certainly may be true, but 1 in 100 million. So I was trying to think of various ways to make clear to people how astoundingly rare it is an event of 1 in 100 million. So one possibility is if you were to go to your local airport and you see a flight is leaving, and you see, among other things, there are some kids there, young kids who are getting on the flight. Do you realize that that youngster, he or she, or whatever pronoun one uses these days, that youngster is 5 times as likely to grow up to be president of the United States as to perish on the forthcoming flight? So if you look at this kid and say he will never be president, think of how rare it is to be killed in the flight. Another way of looking at it is the 1 in 100 million. Let's suppose you were to take one flight every day, Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays included, at a risk of 1 in 100 million per flight. On average, you'd have to go 300,000 years before succumbing to a fatal flight. And not that many of us are going to live 300,000 years. The point is that in the limited span that we have, even if we flew every day, the cumulative risk would be negligible. This is, by the way, an enormous improvement. Back in the first decade after World War II, when commercial flying really began in the US and passenger flying, the risk was about 1 in 100,000. Now, to go from 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 100 million, it actually means the risk has gone down by a factor of 1,000. It was 1,000 times riskier to fly, let's say around 1950, than it is in 2025. And even then, you might say 1 in 100,000, those are pretty good odds. And people were willing to fly then at those odds. But now those odds that were low to begin with have dropped by a factor of 1,000. There are lots of reasons for it because all kinds of technological advances in pilot training, and et cetera, have come together to bring accidents to the verge of extinction. And I consider aviation safety the eighth wonder of the world. That, of course, we can think of things that can go wrong, lots of them, but they almost never happen. And I think that's an astounding tribute. So what I say is that to people sometimes, I say, being afraid to fly in a country like the United States is a little bit like being afraid to go to the supermarket because the ceiling might collapse. And if you go to the supermarket and you don't look up and say, gee, is it about to collapse? Why not feel the same way for something that's equally remote? In other words, when risks get extraordinarily close to zero, we effectively treat them as zero because otherwise we go crazy, right? I mean, everything we do has some level of risk. And if it's close enough to zero, we just say we're not going to worry about it. And I can tell you that aviation, however unintuitive it may be, is in this category of risks that are almost non-existent. And let me say one thing about the event today at Chicago Midway, because like many of you, I've seen many videos of it since it happened. And I know that I was listening to the Chicago television station about how a miracle prevented an inevitable disaster. Now, look, that's not what happened. The fact is that it was, now let me say this, it was a clear day. And as we see the plane coming in on the clear day, the pilots, as pilots always do, as Captain Ron can tell you, look down the runway to make sure everything's okay. And when they saw something was not, they immediately implemented, a go-around, et cetera. And any pilots of any of the airlines we would fly in that situation would have been able to cope with it now. Now, you might say, well, what if it happened at night when it was not as obvious? And that's a real issue. But it turns out there's some fascinating equipment called ASDX, and I don't remember what the letters mean. But basically, if a plane is attempting to land on a runway on which another plane is either on the runway or just about to move across the runway, immediately a warning goes off in the control tower. And the controllers can immediately tell the plane, go around. And it turns out today, I was listening to the tape of the communications between the tower and the planes. The tower very much got the warning that something had gone wrong. And they tried to warn the plane that was crossing the runway not to do so. They didn't have to tell the pilots to go around because the pilots had already initiated it. But if the pilots had not, the controllers would immediately have stepped in and the pilots would have responded instantly. So in other words, this is an event, we wish it hadn't happened, of course, but to suggest that it was, almost a disaster really doesn't deal with the reality that there are so many things that have to go wrong for an accident to occur. And most of the time, at least one of them doesn't go wrong, and that precludes the accident. So I think that people, as Captain Ron is one, these people have done an absolutely fabulous job, and we should feel comfortable while we fly. And
Yeah.
I'm going to be flying to Washington soon. I'm going to be taking American Airlines, the same kind of plane that was in that extraordinarily rare tragedy that occurred, less than a month ago. And I'm not going to be worried. I will look out the window, of course,
Of
as
course.
landing to make sure that nothing unexpected is there. But nonetheless, I think we should not put flying among the activities that we find so fearsome that we don't do it, because it restricts us from doing so much if we can't fly. So I think we should fly. As far as flights 14 hours long, that's impressive. On the other hand, sometimes when the weather is bad, as happened last week, it can take 14 hours to get from LaGuardia to Boston. So, I bet if you went through my travels, I would be able to match that. But anyway, I'm fascinated by what's happening in this program, and I wish you all well. I know that Captain Ron often has a graduation flight. I was honored to take one a few years ago with the students who were going back into the air on Southwest Airlines, actually. And I think it's wonderful when people deal with a fear like this, because it can inhibit their lives so much. And I wish you all the best. And I don't know if you want, I'd be glad to answer any questions now if that would help, or whatever Captain Ron thinks we should do.
Yeah, well, Dieter will monitor any questions that come in there. I was just going to say that the ADS-B that you spoke about, that's related to all the GPS equipment that we have. And then we have a particular instrument like the tower does in our airplanes. And that was activated, when we back up. So that gives us the same type of warning as the airline, as the tower
That's
does.
right.
However, in the case of the Washington crash, the audio is disconnected when you're below 1,000 feet for fear of it saying descend. Descend is the corrective action to take, and pilots will, lose situational awareness and run into the ground or something. But the tower did get the same kind of warning just prior to impact on the DC crash. Unfortunately, the helicopter had already reported that he had the airplane in sight, so the tower controller was less likely to, he was still following it because he did. Unfortunately, they were at the point of impact virtually when he finally said again and challenged them. So.
And now they have changed the flight patterns for helicopters in Washington
Absolutely
drastically to reduce the frequency of helicopters around the Potomac, around the airport. So when these tragedies occur, and they're very rare, they basically make us safer, because whatever it was that was endangering us before is taken off the table.
Exactly. There's a concept that I was introduced in risk management years ago. It was talked about necessary fallibility. In other words, we have accidents, but and because we're always going to be fallible, but they save many more lives than what may be lost, even if it's a fatal accident over the long haul. The miracle on the Hudson was Sully. There were 35 findings, I believe, separate findings. Only 5 of them directly related to that particular set of circumstances. The other 30 were things that they gleaned that went out into the system and will change the future, and with recommendation stuff. So that's a really good point. Yeah, it's incredibly safe. And I had thought of a question myself here that I previewed before we started here, Arnie, and that is, do people need to know that, that this is a pattern, or is this an anomaly today, the Midway thing? Do you have any thoughts about that, or any comments?
Oh, well, it's certainly an anomaly, and that given all the publicity it got, you can rest assured if it had happened last Thursday, we would have heard about it.
Yeah.
So these events are rare, but they are not as dangerous as they may seem. And now, particularly given that there's nervousness because of recent events, the media are watching more closely than ever. And we're going to be hearing about all kinds of things, which really are quite routine. And you know, I was
Absolutely.
driving today. We have these traffic circles and rotaries. I don't know where you live, and you know, people are supposed to give way. Of course, in Massachusetts, the way we drive, that's a different. But in any case, I was going to the rotary, and I had the right of way, and a car came and darted ahead of me. And I wouldn't go home and say, oh, I was almost in a terrible collision, because we sort of understand these things happen. That, in other
Yeah.
words, they're really sort of a little bit of a part of life. And they don't rise to the level of disaster except extraordinarily rarely. So, in the same way, when we hear about things that are far from causing disasters, we should recognize they're far from causing disasters. I mean, look at the video and say, if you were the pilot on the Southwest plane, you would have seen that, because we could see
Mhm.
it so easily, and you would have known what the pilots, of course, know what to do. So I think we should be careful now, because in the days ahead, we're going to be hearing about all kinds of things that are really very minor that we never would have heard about except for the heightened tension right now.
When you mentioned rotaries, having been to Boston, the further west you go, the fewer they are. You know, they're more novelty out here than they are back there. And of course in Europe, in Rome and Paris, they're incredibly intimidating if you're from the U.S. and you haven't done that much. But my position is that in many cases, when you enter that rotary as a driver in the United States, and certainly in Europe or Mexico for that, the rule, you have a different set of rules that you operate by, and you're more vigilant when you go in there. And so I've never seen a study, but I'd be curious to see how many accidents they have in rotaries versus just an intersection. Because I have a pilot
Mhm.
friend whose wife was T-boned on her way to work one day, and that was the end of her life. And she, because she assumed that the traffic light would be observed by traffic that's crossing, and they didn't. And so and you touched on the fact that everything much more likely to be in the news now if it happens, or if something happens. And again, the reason that this became more newsworthy, this being the DCA crash, was perhaps because it had been 15 years since we'd had a fatal accident. So it plays on the humanness of us all.
Ron,
Yes.
let me just jump in here real
Yeah.
quick. A couple of comments and questions. So Jennifer says, thank you, Dr. Burnett, for your wisdom. I'm a fearful flyer who is in healthcare, and I'll be flying to Jamaica on Thursday. So um, also Melissa says, hey, it was fun to see you, Ron, on Channel 3 this morning talking about this and putting us at ease. And I also there was one question, and I just want to clarify that and I don't know, Ron, whether or not there is official what happened there, but my understanding about the DC helicopter is that the ADS-B was either non-functional or not turned on. Is that correct? Because the question
That's
is, if
yeah.
everybody knows where everybody is, like that ADS-B, how come that DC happened then? And my understanding.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I have not seen anything beyond the first couple of days where they were speculating that they did not have it on. And that would, I imagine that's one of the things that's going to change along with all that, as Arnie alluded to. One of the things that I haven't seen any other additional follow-up either is allegedly they were using night vision goggles, and they had the new enhanced ones. And what they do, ironically, is they magnify the available light. Well, that works great if you're in the middle of the jungle and you have nothing more than an eighth of a moon or something. But when you're at low altitude in the DC area, you've got nothing but city lights out there in front of you. And I think that what we're going to find out for sure is it contributed to the likelihood that they had the wrong airplane in sight. And again, Arnie mentioned that the number of links in the chain of accident
Yeah.
occurring is really a factor. And one of the things was that airplane, they had sent it around to runway 33, which meant it moved
Mhm.
a little further to the east. It would, if they hadn't done that, they did that for traffic flow, so they could get more airplanes off, because there was a whole line of airplanes waiting to depart because they were in the middle of an airline bank there. And when they did that further set it up, because had they landed in sequence on the assigned runway, they would have been gone before the helicopter had ever gone there. So it's just what happens to us as human beings, and it's no less likely if you leave your house 15 minutes earlier. You'll never know if you had left 15 minutes later whether you might have been involved in a T-bone accident in an intersection, or vice versa. And of course, that's who the news media, that's who they look for. They look for, when there's a turbulence incident and they land, they look for the most hysterical person who just said, I thought I was going to die. Well, of course you did, because you don't have a frame of reference for that. And when something like this happens, they interview people who are understandably upset by it. We're all upset, but you have to put it in perspective. So let me move on to some of the slides, because I think that a couple of slides that I did, I think you'll have something to say about, Arnie, and we'll talk about that. And the what I'm addressing here is, you mentioned it's statistically so low to be absurd that you'll be in a fatal accident on a commercial airplane. One of the things, and that does bother some people, I say that they have more of a mechanical fear about the technical things that can go wrong in the system with aviation. There's now actually a much larger percentage report. They will tell me verbally, they'll say, I'm not worried, Capt Ron, about the airplane crash, and I know it's safe, I can read the news and all that. What I'm worried about is being up there, and I think of these stories, or I think of whatever it is that triggers me, and then I'm really concerned because I can't pull off to the side of the road at 35,000 feet. So it's more of the humanness that goes on. And I tell them, I said, well, if you didn't have some underlying concern about crashing, you wouldn't have the overriding concern about being trapped in the airplane. And of course, the underlying basis for all of what we see, what I see in fear of flying, is the prevalence of the lack of control. We as humans, we just like to think that we're in control. So I put a little piece together here about talking about some of the psychological makeup of the brain and how we function. And I just said why we connect the dots. And that's because that's clearly what most of the people I've been talking to, especially the last week, have been talking about. So, do you ever wonder why our brains automatically look for patterns even when there aren't any? That's the way we're wired. We got that from our ancestors who survived. Our ancestors who did not evolve in that same way, they didn't make the cut. They ended up on somebody's lunch menu. So that's why it's particularly problematic, in that when things happen, we look for patterns. And that's the nature of your job, isn't it, Arnie? To some degree, you look for patterns and you use statistics to seek them out and predict. And so tonight, I just thought we'd take a couple of looks at this. We also explore how cognitive biases shape the way we perceive risks when it comes to flying. And we have mental shortcuts in many of our functions of life, but they can be really problematic when it comes to aviation. So I'll just take a look at that. And again, here, we're wired to recognize patterns out there in our environment. And way back when our ancestors were evolving, if they spotted a rustling bush and they didn't realize or didn't at least suspect it might be a predator, it could have been the difference between life and death. And I like to say we inherited the worry genes from those ancestors of ours who did pay attention to that. And so maybe that's why when we hear about a few plane crashes or incidents like the Southwest incident, we start thinking that flying is more dangerous than it actually is. And we try to connect the dots, so to speak, even when the dots aren't really there. And I think what you said, Arnie, about when you look at, what did you say, 1,000 times less likely today than back in the 50s that we're going to be involved in it. Yeah. We have this is one of the many heuristics, and it's just a rule of thumb that we form as human beings. And this work was pioneered by a fellow named Daniel Kahneman, who just died last year at the age of 90. Amazing man. I would love to have met him. I'm glad that I met you, Arnie, before you, because I so admire your ability, one, to do the work you do, and two, to teach it the way you do. But we remember to a large degree and judge risk based on what we can easily remember. It's far easier to remember that a Southwest airplane had to go around today than it is to remember the statistics that Arnie just talked about. And that's one of the things that we're faced with. The plane crashes make the news because they are rare and dramatic and stick in our minds. I mentioned the fact that we hadn't had a fatal accident in 15 years in the United States. That made us more suspect to that. People, when we went through the Boeing 787 or 737-800 MAX fiasco, and then the door blew off on the Alaskan Airlines and all that, people said, what's going on? Is it safe? And I said, particularly when the 737-800 was reinstated for air travel, I said, if you had to pick an airplane that was the safest one to be on, that would be the one, because the vigilance is so high, not only around that airplane, but on the fact that Boeing is talking about financial survival. And if they don't get their act together, they're not going to make it. So, but in car accidents, they happen all the time. Statistically, based on 40,000 fatalities a year, every day 109 people die in an automobile accident. But they just don't grab the radar unless you happen to know one of the people who was involved, or you happen to witness one, or you see it on social media now. So the result is we feel like flying is more dangerous, even though the statistics, as Arnie so eloquently stated, show the exact opposite. And it's not what's risky, it's what grabs our attention. Another phenomenon is something called confirmation bias. If I have a belief that flying is inherently dangerous, my mind is now wired from our ancestors again to look into, and it's biased, it looks out into the environment and it will find things to support my fear. Gosh knows, you see that in the political polarization. If I'm on one side or the other, all I see is the reasons that support my conclusion why we should behave in certain ways. And the other thing that I touched on before was the need to feel in control. We just are creatures of control. And that's one of the dilemmas, that we have this higher self. We can not only experience the event that happens and we may be part of, but we can also have a sense of watching ourselves and witnessing that can exacerbate our fear, and it can also allow you to distance oneself from the emotional urgency of it. And so that's both the good news and the bad news. And I teach something called distanced self-talk from a neuroscientist named Ethan Kross, who wrote a book called Chatter. It's a way of putting something that I might personalize in the first person, putting it using myself, my name, putting it in the third person, and it helps me to detach somewhat emotionally from it and get away from the severity of the feelings that I feel. When something unpredictable happens, our brains scramble to make sense of it. And that's why you've got to rely on people who have expertise in the area in which you're finding yourself caught. If you don't, you're really opening yourself up for a lot more trouble oftentimes. And that's the reason why people look for patterns and causes behind plane accidents and incidents, because it makes the world feel a little less random. And even when the reasoning is flawed, having cause to point to gives us a sense of order in an otherwise unpredictable world. We like to be able to predict. And the other thing is, the last one, the bias, is a negativity bias. Again, coming from our ancestors, they had to develop a sense of bias to look at situations in the worst possible scenario because they couldn't afford mistakes. And that has descended upon us in our genes. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we don't have the same risks that they have, but we do have the same response mechanism inside of us. And that particular instinct today makes us fixate on negative news like plane crashes, even though they are incredibly rare. That's why so many people fear flying, despite the fact that they always put one of the safest ways. I read something I thought was interesting about what's your chances of dying with lightning strike and all this. And it says that you're more likely to die as a pedestrian than you are in a commercial airplane accident, which is a no-brainer to me. So we touched on this. I'll just pass over this quickly. The media is there. We could get angry at them. I don't. They're there to report the news. And in today's world, unlike when I was younger, where it was more of a loss leader in a TV network, now it's a profit generator. So now we're more inclined, and particularly with the competition from social media, everybody's more inclined to write flashy headlines that are guaranteed to grab our attention. And so before you know it, a couple of isolated incidents, now your bias, you're picking all those out. You're looking for them on your social media. Okay. And stories versus statistics. I found this interesting. It's our brains love a good story. We're narrative by nature. Without narrative, we can't explain anything either to ourselves or others around us. And again, it's how we're wired. A single dramatic event like a plane crash sticks with us way more than cold hard statistics that show flying is incredibly safe. So that's why I get people like Arnie in here. We gotta sing your praises, Arnie. We gotta put you up in neon lights to get more attention to that. And that's why people tend to fear rare but shocking events over everyday risks that are actually more dangerous, a la driving a car versus getting in a commercial airplane. The more emotional the story, the more power it has over our perception of reality. That's one of the frustrations I have when I'm invited to do a media interview. It's sound bites. I never know whether I'm going to get 15 seconds or a minute and a half. And they're constantly asking you ahead, okay, now we can you do this? Give me 3 tips to overcome your fear of flying. It's a lot more complex than that. We didn't get that way in a minute and a half. We're not going to get out of it in a minute and a half. So the reality, bottom line, air travel is safer now than it's ever been. The number of accidents has been dropping for years. In fact, somebody did a study of July or January of last month, and I think they went back a year, and they said the number of accidents and incidents worldwide are fewer leading up to the recent ones than it's ever been before. So, but the problem, our perception of risk is shaped more like by headlines than reality. And just because a plane crashes or you have an incident like you did in Midway Airport today and makes big news doesn't mean they're common. And just because you feel at risk doesn't mean that you are in fact in danger. And that's another thing that's hard to distort. So to just kind of sum all this up, and then we'll go back and look for some other closing questions, perhaps. When we understand how our brains work, we can take control of our fears instead of letting them control us. And overcoming anxiety, which an anxiety disorder, which is what fear of flying is, it's an active sport. It's not something you sit by on the sidelines. And that's, I think, another thing. People have this myth that it's amorphic or amorphous, and you can't. It's abstract, and you can't do anything until you get on the airplane. It's not true. You can study education, learn how to disrupt and distract your thinking, and join a group of other like-minded people and share experiences, and that those are things you can do. And once we recognize these shortcuts we make, confirmation bias, negativity bias, we can shift our perspective and make a more informed decision before we buy into all the media stuff out there. I'm going to go back and any other thoughts that you've had, Arnie? Listen to me.
Well, maybe I'll introduce yet another statistic.
Perfect.
Did you know every day, including today, 12 million people around the world board airplanes? The number today who were injured was 0. The number today who was killed was 0. It was the same thing yesterday, the same thing almost every day, almost every single day, all around the world. And it's this silence which really is the continuing testimony to how safe we are. And I think, as Ron said, that it has trouble competing with tigers racing toward you,
right,
in your brain, and the negativity fears. I mean, I'm from New York City. Negativity is our way of life, but I didn't realize that in terms of aviation, it's more widespread, but the risks are extraordinarily low. If I may say something, I hope this doesn't interfere with the narrative. I have a suggestion, and that is particularly for the adults on board. If you're afraid to fly, I don't see anything wrong with having a glass of wine on a plane. Or
absolutely.
2 glasses. I know some people take Xanax, and I don't know whether they take weed or whatnot, but I don't consider that a crutch. I think it's perfectly natural that we should do things that relax us. And I myself, particularly on a flight where there's turbulence, will certainly enjoy a glass of wine. The prices are sometimes outrageous, but
Right.
but it's worth it. So
Yeah.
I hope people will be taking flights soon. And I
Yeah.
hope that when they find the flight is calm, they'll realize that this is an experience they should bear in mind and not just the things they hear in the headlines. Anyway, so
And
I
I'll
wish
add,
you all the
yeah.
best of trips.
I'll add to that, Arnie. I totally support medication, whether it's alcohol or prescription drugs. A couple of things that I say to that. One, if you can, do it to a minimum so that it doesn't disarm your amygdala so much that you don't get any therapeutic benefit
Mhm.
of the
Yeah.
exposure, which is what you're really trying. You have to be agitated in order to make that agitation, learn from it, and
Yes.
realize how to manage it. And with that, and then there's a couple of caveats. If you definitely want to do this in concert if you're taking medications with your doctor,
Mhm.
and I recommend, and he should recommend this, I think, take a small dosage like Xanax or Ativan before you get on the airplane, because I've had people tell me horror stories where they didn't do that. They got on and took it, and one of the side effects potentially of Xanax, for example, or the benzodiazepine family, is it makes you more anxious. So that would be at the wrong time to learn that when you're on board a flight. But certainly I support doing that, because if you can reduce yourself from a 10 to a 5, let's say, bring yourself back from that emotional edge, now you can practice some other strategies and you can do some other things, and maybe you can wean yourself
Yeah.
away from the need to do that. So, but it's certainly a reliable thing. And knowing yourself, knowing oneself is, in so many things, that's what's important. Yeah. Dieter, any questions or any other comments that we might want to introduce?
Yeah, so I just want to share Melissa's post, because that is really, I think, the bulk of the people who actually get in touch with us. And she says it's so frustrating to remember flying alone when I was in my early 20s and I was fine, and in brackets before I was a mom, versus the last 10 plus years and I'm a wreck during takeoff and general flying. It's it's process reward getting through the flight to be on vacation. And I just wanna say that we have we say it all the time, that the pain in your brain is not about the plane. And while obviously without knowing anything else, Melissa, but what we can say is that especially fear flying is one of those things that loves to transfer in terms of other psychological, emotional kind of fears or challenges, particularly because it is something that we don't do very often, most of us, anyways. And I would just recommend, come to one of our webinars, like really work through it, because like Arnold said, it's just one, it's statistically unlikely, but more importantly, it's having a great time while you're doing it. And flying is just, to me, it's still awe-inspiring. And I know, Ron, you've flown, 40 plus years. I think even you are still in awe by,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I got bitten by the bug when I was very young, watched a lot of World War II movies were the thing in those days. And it is. A lot of people tell me, I can't understand. I love the thought of flying. I get excited being able to look out the window, but I'm terrified. So, having said that, as we wrap tonight, I just want to leave you with this. Fear is powerful, but so are you. And the more we understand how our minds work, the more control we gain over our fears. And that's what this journey is all about: learning, growing, and proving to yourself that you're more capable than you ever would have thought. Every time you take a step forward, whether it's listening to this show, practicing a new mindset shift, or even just challenging your own thoughts, you're rewriting your own story of your fear. And that's kind of our motto: is you got to change the story that you tell yourself about flying, because Nothing else changes unless you change that. So as you go about your evening, I hope you remember this. Flying is safe, and you are much stronger than your anxiety. Your anxiety is real and a part of you, but it's not all of who you are. And no matter where you are in your journey, you're not alone. We're in this together. And thanks for spending your time with me tonight. Until the next time, keep believing in yourself, moving forward. And as always, I hope to see you in the sky or see you contributing this way. So Arnie, thanks again for letting us keep you up, even if you are a night owl. We don't like to take responsibility for that. Thanks, Dieter, for the support, and thanks to all you out there. We can't wait to see you again next week for another episode. Have a great week, everybody.